Thank you, everybody, for coming to the Aaron Torres podcast YouTube page. If you could do me a quick favor, if you do enjoy the video that you came here to watch, do me a favor, go ahead and hit that little red subscribe button at the bottom of the screen. It really does help my audience grow. It really does help this channel grow. It means more than you realize. So go ahead, hit that little red button. Also, remember, full episodes of the Aaron Torres podcast, wherever you download your podcast, Apple, Spotify, etc. Now, here is the video that you came here for. And on Monday, we had yet another head coach let go. As we wait for Brian Harsin, we already had two, Scott Frost and Herm Edwards. And a third coach was let go, Jeff Collins, fired at Georgia Tech. It is worth noting the AD who hired him, Todd Stansbury, was let go as well. Georgia Tech, the third Power 5 school to let go of its head coach. And what I would say about this one, this is one where I really have no super strong opinion about it. No super emotional attachment, right? I think we all kind of wanted Scott Frost to work at Nebraska, native son returning to his school, all that good stuff. I think we all liked Coach O. We wanted to see that one work. This one, there really is I don't think any real argument that Jeff Collins should have been kept. Now, I will say he did not inherit an easy situation. For people who do not remember, prior to him at Georgia Tech, Paul Johnson was the head coach. He was a triple option coach. And so when Jeff Collins took over, he had the unenviable task of basically revamping the entire roster on the fly. When you run the triple option, you need a running quarterback, you need wide receivers that can block, you need smaller offensive linemen to get downfield and block upfield. And when he came in, he was tasked with basically completely revamping the program, and it was a really tough assignment. At the same time, it is worth noting that through 3.5 years, he had gone 10-28, 7-19 in the ACC. And it's not as though Paul Johnson left a complete mess at Georgia Tech. Paul Johnson, in 11 years there, went to 9 bowl games, including his final season. So I'm not saying that it was one of those deals where it was a super easy rebuild and this guy didn't need time, Jeff Collins. But this is now year 4, 3-9, 3-7, 3-9, 1-3, and you're just now getting into the heart of the ACC. It felt like it was time. It felt like it was not working. And, to quote Trev Alberts, the Nebraska AD, when he fired Scott Frost, it just feels like you needed another voice in that locker room. So I am not surprised. Now, what will be interesting is what happens next to Georgia Tech, because this is low key one of the more intriguing job openings, I believe, in college football, because it has a lot of real positives and a lot of real negatives as well for the next head coach. I think there's a lot of people across college football that believe this is potentially a sleeping giant in college football. And it's for one really obvious reason. It's in the heart of maybe the most talent-rich city in America in terms of high school football recruiting, Atlanta, Georgia. Listen, you don't need me to tell you the stats and the analytics and the data, but Atlanta is right up there with Houston and Miami and Los Angeles in terms of the volume of high school players that come out of Atlanta, right? So, a job like Nebraska opens and you sit there and say, how good is it really in a world where they have 2, 3, 4 real high major recruits in the entire state of Nebraska on any given year? Well, Atlanta has 25, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 in most years. And so it is a job where with the right coach, you can go in and recruit and be in a place to have success right away. I say it all the time. We talk about good job, bad job, this job, that job in college football. The best jobs are the ones where you have the access to the most good players, and there aren't many that have more access to more good players than Georgia Tech. And even if you want to argue that they are in a city that is surrounded by Bulldogs fans and, right down the road is the reigning national champion recruiting at an insane level, I would say Georgia only has 25 scholarships, and Georgia really has taken on a national recruiting approach over the last couple years where, yes, they're still going to get their guys out of Georgia, but they really go all over the country to look for players that they believe can come in and be difference makers for this program. Brock Bowers, that tight end that everybody loves, he's from California, okay? Keely Ringo, the star cornerback, who I believe is going to be the number one pick. He's not going to be the number one pick, but he's going to be a first-round pick this year. He's from the state of Arizona. So Georgia has very much become a national recruiting team. They want the best players from wherever. They'll go wherever. They're going to supplement it with Georgia prospects. But even if Georgia took 25 guys out of the state of Georgia, there's still plenty left over for Georgia Tech. And that's why it's so intriguing. Like I said, whether it's Nebraska, Colorado, Washington, I mean, there's a lot of really good historical jobs that don't have the recruiting advantages built in that Georgia Tech does. And that is why it is so intriguing. But it's also worth noting, by the way, and I do think this is important, that there are a lot of disadvantages with Georgia Tech as well. First of all, I just talked about one of them. Basically, I just told you right there. Yes, Georgia Tech is in one of the most talent-rich areas in the country, if not the most talent-rich area in the country. The flip side to that is it's in the heart of SEC country where everybody recruits out of Atlanta. Auburn is obviously just down the road from Atlanta. Alabama is obviously going to come into Atlanta and recruit. Clemson isn't in the SEC, but they come in and recruit. Tennessee comes in and recruits. Florida State, Miami, it doesn't matter who. Everybody recruits Atlanta, and so it makes it that much tougher. And then on top of that, there are other variables that need to be talked about when it comes to this job, the main one being academics. Now, what I've been told, I did some homework. It was kind of one of these jobs that you knew was probably going to open up. And so I made a few calls, talked to some people that would be in the know. And the sentiment that I got is that as far as the academics are concerned at Georgia Tech, it's a little bit different than some other places, right? There's some places that it's just really hard to get good football players, good athletes with questionable grades into school. It's something that every Notre Dame coach of my lifetime, dating back to Lou Holtz 30 years ago, has been complaining about. Stanford. I've talked to coaches at Stanford that are just like, it doesn't matter how good you are, how far you can throw a football, how high your vertical leap is, how fast you can throw a fastball. If you don't have the grades, we cannot get you into Stanford. And so I bring it up because my understanding is that Georgia Tech is not a place where you can't get kids into school, period. The problem does become what happens once they get there. It's an engineering school, and there aren't a lot of majors for kids who don't take academics seriously and don't want to major in engineering, right? And so, this isn't a public school like Georgia or Alabama or LSU or Ohio State where there's a bunch of sociology degrees and whatever. Basically, once you get them into school, the degree limitation, I think, does hurt recruiting a little bit. The other thing that I found really interesting, I was talking to my buddy Garrett Carr, who, again, I told you the other day, writes for Aaron Torres Online, does a really good job. Garrett brought up this point. I confirmed it. It's really interesting. About 65, 66%, 2 out of 3 students at Georgia Tech is male. Now, you might sit there and say, that's not a big deal. Who cares? Blah, 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 blah. I'm telling you, I know in this PC world, you're not allowed to say stuff like that. It does matter to high school football players. Not all of them. Not all of them. Now, look, BYU has a great football team right now. So clearly, the male-female population is not important to everybody, but it does matter to some high school recruits. By the way, it matters to some professional athletes too. There's a reason NBA players don't want to play in Utah, in Minnesota, in Milwaukee, in Cleveland, do want to play in Miami, Los Angeles, Houston. I'm just saying that is a factor in this as well, is that you have academic restrictions. It is a male-oriented school. So take that information as what you want, but there are real pluses and there are real minuses to the Georgia Tech job. So the question becomes now, who do you go after? And I do think this is one where there is one very obvious name that is impossible to miss. And I think it's Deion Sanders. And listen, we talked a lot about Deion last week on this show about the Auburn job. Basically, I said, look, Auburn's not open, but it's going to open. Go get Deion. He would kill in the SEC. He would kill in recruiting. And a lot of the same variables come into play with Deion. But what makes this one different is I think there are a lot of jobs that Deion will be a call. I do think Deion should be the first call in this one for one very specific reason. And there is actually a chance that he says yes. And that reason is pretty straightforward. He's obviously got a lot of ties to the city of Atlanta. I know there's a lot of young people that listen to this show that don't remember. He is not only a former Atlanta Falcon, he is also a former Atlanta Brave. And while Deion Sanders' name resonates everywhere, it is a little bit different in Atlanta. He is an icon in that city. And I think while Deion could recruit anywhere in the country, I do think that he would have a special cachet and extra cachet in the city of Atlanta where he played, Major League Baseball and NFL football. I think he could go into any high school, get a sit down with any recruit, any coach. Any coach is going to say, hey, you got to at least meet with Deion. Parents are going to love him. I think it would be great. And then, as I told you with Auburn, the actual win-loss record speaks for itself. 15-2 since the start of last season. One of those losses was to an FBS team. Remember, he's at Jackson State. And keep in mind this, he has proven the ability to recruit high-level players. It's not just because he's at a lower level or this or that or the other thing. This is a guy that got the #1 high school player in America to flip from Florida State, beat Nick Saban, Kirby Smart, Mike Norvell out for the #1 player in America. They also got a 4-star wide receiver later on in the cycle as well that was a top 100 prospect. And so if Deion can do that at Jackson State, he can certainly do it in the ACC at Georgia Tech, at a school that competes at the highest level of college football with Clemson, with Miami, with Florida State, etc. What will be interesting to see about Deion is a couple things. One, as great as that recruiting is, does he see those restrictions and say, I don't know if this is the one for me? And I think that's going to be the interesting conversation just about Deion in general as he looks at the next step of his career. I think everybody knows he interviewed for several Power 5 jobs, including Arkansas, I guess, when they hired Sam Pittman, including TCU within the last year. But I think now that he has things rolling at Jackson State, I think he is going to be very particular about the jobs that he takes seriously in terms of actually interviewing for, okay? And serious in terms of actually taking. He's got it rolling at Jackson State. I think he loves that narrative of restoring the HBCUs. And what I would also say on top of that is I just don't know how many of these jobs really interest him. And is Georgia Tech, as great as the recruiting is, in a city that he loves, is it enough to get him to leave? I do not know. A couple other names that I do think are a factor with Georgia Tech. One, I'll say it, I think this guy has been overhyped in terms of being a candidate at most places. I do think Bill O'Brien, the Alabama offensive coordinator, makes sense. And if you follow this college football coaching carousel stuff, I don't know who Bill O'Brien's agent is, but give this guy credit. He must get paid per mention because every job that has opened the last 2-3 years, LSU, Nebraska this year, I can't even remember, Miami, maybe Florida. Bill O'Brien's name was listed with all of them, USC. And it's like Bill O'Brien is not a candidate at all these places. I do think Georgia Tech makes sense, though. He was an assistant coach there for 8 years before going to the NFL with Bill Belichick. And I do think he's familiar with the school. It's kind of a rebuild. He had that big rebuild at Penn State where he really got things off the ground post Joe Paterno. And so I'm not saying it will happen, but this is one of the few that does make a lot of sense for me to Bill O'Brien because he has the ties, he has the rebuilding experience. I do think being a former Alabama assistant would bring, kind of cachet, to the coaching job at Georgia Tech. So I think he's one to keep an eye on. A couple other names, I was actually thinking about this. I think this is a spot that makes sense for Dan Mullen. Listen, we know Dan Mullen isn't going to do TV for the next 30 years. He's working at ESPN right now. And for all of the struggles that he had at the end of his Florida reign, one, he was actually pretty good at Florida the first few years. 10-3, 11-2, started 8-1 his third year before it completely fell off. And then it really fell apart last year. But he was really good at Mississippi State. And I do wonder, is this the right spot for him? We know Dan Mullen is not a guy that is going to be super successful in a fishbowl type job like Florida, like a major SEC school. But he was really good at Mississippi State where he was off the grid, where there weren't those national title expectations. And does this spot make sense for him? Now, the one thing about Dan Mullen, he doesn't love to recruit, so he'd have to hire himself a darn good recruiting staff. But he's a guy that, in my opinion, makes sense. Hugh Freeze, friend of the Aaron Torres pod. I've had him on a few times. This is one where I think Hugh Freeze is going to get one of these big time jobs this year. I just think he's been successful at Liberty for long enough. 10-1 2 seasons ago, 3-1 this year. They actually played Wake Forest the other day as tough as Clemson did. They lost by 1 to Wake Forest. Clemson holds on to win in overtime. So I think this might be a landing spot for Hugh Freeze. Now, again, does he look for kind of like Deion? Does he look for something that maybe is a little bit more, he has SEC ties. Does he want to stay in the SEC footprint? I think he is a major player at Auburn if and when it opens. I know for a fact there are important people at Auburn that want that guy to be the next head coach, but he's a guy. Maybe Auburn doesn't open. Maybe somehow Brian Harsin goes on a run and they beat everybody but Georgia and Alabama and they go 9-3. I don't think it's going to happen, but who knows? And so if maybe Auburn doesn't open, maybe this is a spot that makes sense for Hugh Freeze. Jamie Chadwell, I would add too. Of course, another friend of the Aaron Torres pod. He is at Coastal Carolina, really successful the last couple of years. He is, if you remember back to the COVID season, he was a guy that had Coastal Carolina rolling. They went 11-1 during the COVID season, 11-2 last year, 4-0 this year. It's very well noted. His wife has historically said that she does not want to leave the southeast portion of the country. That's where he spent most of his career. So does that one make sense for Jamie Chadwell? Really fun offense. I think that's the thing that you could sell is I put up a lot of points. We're going to score a ton. And I think that sells with recruits. And I think that is a name that makes sense. But I'm telling you, you got to put all your eggs in the Deion basket and make him say no. And then after that, I do think it gets really interesting with Hugh Freeze, with Dan Mullen. Finally, what I would also say is the most important part of this whole conversation is who is actually making the hire. Never forget the AD got fired as well. So I think you got to get an AD in place before you make the head coaching hire.